We're very excited today. We got a great presentation from Robert Latham. Um, he is a clinical instructor and practitioner in residence at the University of Miami Children and Youth Law Clinic. He teaches students mostly involved in abuse, abandoned and neglected cases, but he litigates in all forums, including the courts, appeals, federal, state, and most important for our purposes, administrative hearings. Mr. Latham graduated from University of Texas, and he was a top lawyer in his class at the University of Michigan, where he was a fellow of the Michigan Child Advocacy Law Clinic. He's won numerous awards. I've actually given him awards before, including the Child Advocate of the Year from Florida Children's First, the Fearless Children's Lawyer from the American Bar Association, which is the national organization, 40 under 40 Outstanding Lawyers of South Florida by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the Florida Trailblazers Award from the Daily Business Review. But he's had a lot more awards. I just tried to pick out 4 that I thought would show his prominence. He has written comments on the same issues we have written comments on, involving the home and community-based services, and also has filed class actions for children in foster care. He's on the Developmental Disability Advocacy Strategy Group as a task force member, and he is often who reporters go to when they need to know what's happening and get a quote, including the Washington Post and every major newspaper in Florida. Robert, thanks for coming today. I appreciate it. And today's subject is rulemaking, what people can do to impact it. I would like to add that this video will be on our YouTube channel and will be shared to the people that register. So a lot of people register because they want to get the YouTube channel, and they will get certificates if they ask for them. So thank you, Robert. Looking forward to it.
Alan, thank you so much, both for the introduction and for inviting me to do this. When I was doing the preparation for this presentation, I realized there is not a lot of guidance out there on how to participate in rules workshops. So I'm hoping that we can create something that's useful for people. I am going to share screen. Hopefully, give me 1 second. I am going to share screen, and there we go. And hit present. Alan, can you see that?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect, thank you. So let me start by, again, thanking everybody for having me here. One of the many things that I've done over my career is train young people to testify and train young people to speak in legislative settings and in administrative settings. And so a lot of the tips and ideas you're going to hear today are from those trainings, but they are applicable to everyone. So here's our plan. 1 second, I'm still having trouble here. Here's our plan for today. So we're going to start off with a little bit about administrative rules and what they are. We're going to look at the public input process, which is the comment process that many of you have participated in or will be. We're going to talk about what makes an effective comment and what doesn't. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we prepare ourselves to go into advocacy mode, and what we can do to both help make us stronger advocates, but also more effective advocates. I understand that a lot of people in this room today are very seasoned advocates. So for all of you, I hope that this is a resource for you to help train the other people in your lives and in your communities that need training and can get up to speed with you. Alan asked me some technical questions about the Administrative Procedures Act before we started. I'm going to warn you, I am not going to answer a lot of those questions on a recording. Partly because the process of all of this changes, and I want this training to live longer than just today. So a lot of the procedures will change, the timelines will change. So I'll answer questions generally, and I'll point you to where you can look those answers up. So let's start off. Again, many of you know this, but if you're explaining it to someone else, here's how you would do it. What are administrative rules? And so the first thing to note is that you were taught back in civics class or wherever you learned about government that the legislature makes the laws, the executive branch implements them or executes them, and the judicial branch resolves disputes or says what the law is. And that was always an overly simplified version of the truth, right? In practice, all three branches of government make laws. They issue decrees and rules that are binding on us as citizens. And so the administrative rules are the laws that come out of the executive branch. In Florida, the executive branch is housed in the office of the governor and all the departments. Executive branch rules, administrative rules, regulations, they're called all those things, are incredibly important. There are more regulations than there are statutes by orders of magnitude. They impact every part of our life. They impact our healthcare, the food we eat, the quality of our schools, as it says there. Every single thing is regulated. And there is a lot of debate about whether that should be true or not. But for today, we can accept the fact that it is true. One of my favorite departments, one of my favorite agencies in Florida, is very Florida specific, is the Department of Citrus. It highly regulates oranges, tangerines, and everything in between. And it creates laws and rules that are binding on people, both for good and for bad. Let's talk a little bit really quickly about why we have these rules, because it helps us understand, our advocacy when we go in to do our advocacy, what we're up against. And so one of the reasons we have these rules is efficiency. The legislature does not have the time or the expertise to regulate everything that they pass laws on. So the Department of Citrus is in charge of defining when an orange is ripe, and they do it in really complex technical ways. If the legislature had to debate that and vote on that in the legislative setting, that's all they would do. They would never get anything else done. So what the legislature does for efficiency is passes on rulemaking authority to the departments or to the agencies. The other thing that this process is hopefully going to promote is transparency. You don't have to go back far in American history for when agencies were autonomous, when a person was put in charge of an agency, and they just simply ruled by fiat and decree of whoever was in charge at that moment. The rules process makes the agencies more transparent to the public and more stable over time in administrations. It is hard to change rules. Rules have to go through this complicated process to change them. And that, in theory at least, is a good thing, so that every time there's a new governor, every time there's a new agency head, we don't have wild shifts in our law. And the last thing that the rulemaking promotes is actually deregulation. It is hard to make rules, and there's lots of opportunities to challenge them. So by having to write down the rules and make the expectations clear, it does have a process. It furthers our process of deregulation. It furthers a process of having a chance to kind of carve away rules that are unnecessary or outside the scope of the law. Different governors have taken different approaches on this over the years. Some have kind of famously tried to suspend all rules and start from scratch. That was held unconstitutional. We have rules for all these reasons, and governors have to operate within them. So this is the process I'm not going to go over in a lot of detail, because one, it's very complicated, and two, it changes a lot. But in general, what happens is the legislature passes laws that lay out the general frameworks of the programs and policies they want to see implemented. They specifically give the agencies authority, sometimes directives, to pass rules. The agencies then have to go through this complicated rulemaking process, including publishing notices to the public, receiving public input, which is what our training is about today, drafting the rules, publishing the drafts, getting more input, and eventually running the rules both by the legislature and the governor himself. And it then becomes a final rule. Alan's question to me before we started was, when is a rule final? And that is a philosophical question. And the answer is, it's final when it gets published and it's sent over to the Department of State and it's published. You will know it's final at that point. Up until that point, I think it's actually largely debatable whether a rule is final or not, and that can create some interesting advocacy opportunities, especially for the lawyers. After the rule is published and it goes into effect, people may still disagree with it. And so the courts become involved as well in judicial review of the rule. So if somebody challenges a rule, or if somebody has a conflict that involves a rule, the courts can look at that rule and the process that went into making it, and they can actually determine that a rule is invalid. And this has very famously happened over the course of our American history, and even in recent years. So I want to give you one concrete example of what this looks like. So here we have in the top left, we have a statute. It's 393-066. It's a Florida statute that directs the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. And it says that contracted persons or entities shall meet any requirements established by the agency for training and professional development. The legislature does not have the expertise to set those training standards. They don't. And so they've told the agency, pass rules on that. We give you that power. If you then move over to the administrative rule, the administrative rule says, and again, I pulled out just one provision of it, any basic training that must be taken on a periodic basis does not count towards in-service training requirements. The legislature didn't say that. The executive branch agency said that. It's consistent with the statute. It's probably a good rule. Interestingly, no case law whatsoever. No court has ever been called to rule on whether basic training should count towards in-service training requirements. Maybe that's beneath anybody's need to challenge, but there's no case law on that. There are, however, very famous cases, right, that there have been challenges to. Usually, rules and regulations that impact large industries, large swaths of society, or hit individuals particularly hard. So at the federal level, recently in the last couple of years, you've seen the bump stock ban from the ATF go all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Every year in elections, there's numerous election regulations that get challenged. EPA, SEC, any kind of environmental or economic regulatory bodies are challenged constantly. Why? Because it's affecting people's bottom lines, and there's a clear incentive to challenge those. In the APD context, I found two rule challenges that kind of fit this mold. One was the 2009 challenge to the tiers system, and another one was an implementation of iBudget from 2014. Now, we know that iBudget and all those things did get implemented. It was the 2014 implementation that advocates had a problem with, and the courts did rule that it was invalid at that time. So you'll take away a few things from this, right? First off, that the challenges typically strike down that iteration of the rules, and the agency would have to go back to the drawing board, draft them from scratch, and it can delay a bad rule. It can help you get an opportunity to contribute to creating a good rule as well. So let's keep going. The agency, as part of this rulemaking process, must invite the public to comment. They don't do it with an invitation like the one on the right. It is not that easy to find these invitations, but advocates and organizations who are keyed into this keep track of this very closely. And I think it's our job to make sure that the public knows that this is happening and translate the somewhat archaic technical announcements that get put out by the agencies into something that's a little more inviting. The comments can either be written or verbal. Most comments are in fact written. People write in either a quick email, or they write a more formal comment that's more like a report. There's no set format that the written comments have to be. All of the principles we're going to talk about today apply to written comments as well. Verbal comments happen in the context of a rules workshop. They're called different things in different contexts. We're going to call them rules workshops. These are formal meetings held by the agency to get comments from the public, and they're incredibly important for shaping rules. Who can submit a comment? actually anyone can submit a comment, whether they know anything about the rule or not. There are some notorious, wonderful gadflies in Florida that comment on everything that they possibly can, that show up in the legislature with comments. It is not always clear that they know what they're commenting about, but they have a right as a citizen to do it, and they do it. For our purposes, though, the people that are going to be commenting on our types of rules are going to be citizens, parents, guardians, family members of people affected by the rules, advocacy organizations formed on behalf of or for people that are governed by the rules, organizations, coalitions that form sometimes only in response to a certain rule. Whole advocacy campaigns have been created around specific rules. Some of those are enduring afterwards, some of those are just temporary. And then there's a whole community of professionals, lawyers, policy experts, public administrators who have made their careers out of monitoring rules and trying to make sure that they're good. Uh, so the comments can come from any of these groups. And in fact, we want the comments to come from all of these groups, right? Sometimes the voices of one of these groups can outweigh the voices of others. And it's very important for the legislature, and for the executive branch to hear both from people affected by rules, people who speak on behalf of them, and professional technocrats like me who have opinions about how the rules actually get written. All right, let's keep going. If you wanted to track the rules, there is a website. It is appropriately named Florida Rules, flrules.org. It is hard to use. It was clearly created in the late 90s, early 2000s. It is not easy to navigate, but once you get it set up, you never have to go there again. You can have emails sent to you that will give you the alerts about specific rules or parts of the administrative code that you're interested in. Just for those who have never seen a notice before, here's one on the right. It's very technical, but it does have some useful information in it, including who to contact for more information. So this particular rule doesn't really matter what it was, but if you look down here, it says the name of the person who you would contact, a phone number and an email address. That's who you would reach out to if you had questions. That's who you reach out to for the text of the proposed rules, the rules that they're thinking about writing, the drafts that they've created. They don't put those on the internet. They don't want confusion out there. They don't want people to read them and think they were finalized. I understand that. So if you need a copy of the proposed rule, you can reach out usually to a person listed in the notice. This is powerful. You should, in fact, sign up. It is free. Not all states have these. It's much harder in other states, so I don't want to badmouth the website that much. It's just a little difficult to use. You'll get the hang of it. All right, let's talk about the workshops themselves. We talked about how the agency has to hold a meeting, hold a workshop, and invite people into that space to talk about the rule, to comment on the rule. The format is another thing that I'm going to be very careful not to give you too many details about, because it's different. It's different by agency, and it's different by which rules they're seeking comment on. It can be a phone call, like a giant conference call. It can be a Zoom meeting like this one. It can be an in-person event, or it can be a mix of all three of these. Usually the agencies will have 2 to 3 people from their side in the workshop. There will usually be an agency lawyer. There will usually be a program expert who understands the subject matter of the rule. And there will often be an administrative support person whose job it is just to keep everything moving and keep everything running. And that's an incredibly important and incredibly difficult job. And so that's the person you would really want to have the most contact with sometimes. They will announce how the workshop will operate at the beginning. And sometimes workshops can be line by line, especially on complicated rules. They will just go through the rule line by line, the proposed rule line by line, and ask for comments on each individual line. Sometimes they will go around the room, especially if there's a smaller number of people, and just let each person comment. Sometimes they will have specific questions for you. They will ask questions and get comments on topics that they want to talk about first. You should be prepared for any of those situations, and be flexible when you go into these rules workshops. The agency staff are trying to make it efficient, trying to give everyone an opportunity to speak and be heard. But especially in more contentious rules, there can be a lot of people in these workshops, and there's only a limited amount of time. These are usually set for an hour and a half. A long one would be 2 hours, and they really do need to move through everyone and get the comments. Sometimes they will ask for written comments just to save time. You can, in the workshops, ask questions, though be prepared to be told that they don't know the answer or they'll have to get back to you. That's because they don't necessarily want to always show their cards, or your question was really good and it's something you need to think about. But you do have the right to at least try to ask questions and get feedback on what they're attempting to do with the rules. You may have mixed results with that, but it's worth a try. All right, let's keep going. All right, here's probably the most important, summary of what a comment is. The comment that you're providing to the agency, it's a formal act that you're not just going in and speaking to the agency. This is not a dinner party. You were there essentially to provide a form of testimony. It's not under oath. You're not raising your right hand. You will not be held, responsible for anything that you say in there, directly at least. But you should think of it as that important. The comments should really be thought out, should be planned, and should be as truthful and helpful as you can make them. There's no rule on what a comment has to include by law, but effective comments from all the people that work on the agency side, as they've told us again and again, effective comments are clear, concise, meaning short, well organized, and informative. They introduce you, they say what rule that you're looking to comment on, they explain your position or your analysis, and then the agency staff really want you to have a recommendation. They really want you to, help them understand what you want them to do. It's very hard for them to just get information and then decide what to do with it. So if you have an ask, if you have a recommendation, they want you to make it. As always, interacting with any other professional or anyone, please be respectful. It can be the rules hearings can be contentious, especially on difficult rules. But the goal is to persuade. The goal is to persuade the agency to your position. It's not to anger them. It's not to badger them. It's not to alienate them. It's to persuade and give them both the desire and permission to side with you, right? And so this is comments in general. Let's go through them a little more detail. We'll give some examples in a little bit. But one other point I need to make, and this is, again, we hear this from agency staff a lot, quality is more important than quantity. So there are advocacy campaigns where agencies or organizations will get thousands of people to send in the same comment. That's certainly raises awareness on a rule. It certainly agencies take note of that, especially because they then believe thousands of people might show up to a workshop. But the comments are not a vote. The comments are not a petition. The agency doesn't count the number of pros and cons to a certain rule and then side with whoever sent in more. So while there is some room for that form of advocacy, it is not as helpful to the agency as having an actual effective comment. So more is not better. And the agency staff repeat that to us every time we send thousands of people to them. More is not necessarily better. What is usually better is concise, meaning short, coverage of the issue from different angles. So if you have thousands of people, fine, organize them and have their comments presented in a way that the agency can understand where each group of people are coming from, and have the agency understand the problem from different perspectives. That is incredibly helpful. By contrast, sending the same form email 1,000 times with no information in it, not as helpful to the agency. If you are working with a group, which I will recommend you strongly do, take some time, right? Figure out who your best messenger is for each angle that you want to approach, and try to make each contribution unique in some way. Even if there's a lot of overlap, try to offer something unique for each person who speaks in one of these rules hearings, and that can be incredibly powerful. All right, the essential parts of a comment. Again, the staff at agencies have told us, please introduce yourself, please identify the rule, please offer your analysis or insight, and then please make a recommendation. Um, we're going to go through them in detail, and some strategies for each, but these are the main 4 points. Here we go. Introduce yourself. Who are you? Say your name. In the stress of the moment, people forget to do this. Where are you from? What organization do you work with? And why is it that you are commenting on this rule? What brings you to the rule? What caused, motivated you to be there that day? That can be really powerful. If you're speaking on behalf of a larger group of people, both formal and informal, say it, right? I'm here on behalf of parents like me who have a child that has a developmental disability. I'm here on behalf of a service provider that works in this community and has a lot of concerns, right? If you can make yourself, part of a group, it is more powerful. The next thing to do is identify the rules. And this is where citizens, lay people, tend to struggle the most in these rules workshops. Your comments can't be general. They can't be grievances against the agency in general. They have to be attached to a rule. So even if you take 10 minutes before the workshop, find a rule that speaks to you, find something in the draft language that they've put out that you have problems with, and speak to that rule and about that rule. That will keep it on the road for one of these workshops. Then the staff can actually do something with your comments. General statements about the agency, grievances about the agency, can't really be considered in a rules workshop. There are other ways to gripe about them and complain about them, and that's a different training. But in a rules workshop, they really have to hear comments on the actual proposed rules. The other thing I will say is, and then again, this is a common issue we see with folks that maybe have never participated in one of these workshops before. If you have an open case with the agency, if you have an open issue, it can't be about that case or that issue. The workshop staff cannot resolve case issues for you, and it's not going to be helpful for them to hear about your individual case, and everyone will just be frustrated, including you, because they won't be able to help you. So try not to make it about any open active case. Talk about issues in general, and that will usually keep you on the road here. Let's keep going. So the analysis or comment part is up to you. And I've offered here 4 kind of categories that they often fall into, but your comments on the rules are your experiences, your thoughts, your analysis. So these common categories include problem identification. Is the agency's proposed rule actually solving a problem, or have they created a problem just to pass a rule? Are people really experiencing this problem? Is this problem more complicated or more simple than the agency seems to think? Is there anything you can do to help them understand what the problem is? The next category, common category, is the agency's proposed solution actually effective? Are there existing solutions that are better that they should look at? Are there solutions in other states? Are there other ways to approach the problem? This can be a really effective advocacy tool. Give them a simpler way to solve the same problem, and they will often be thankful to you. The next common analysis that you'll see is cost benefit analysis. The agency may think that their rule is simple and will not impact people. And then you may provide them useful information about how, in fact, it will, and how expensive it will be, and how burdensome it will be. And this can be really useful information to an agency. They're often not trying to burden people or make things excessively expensive. There are, in fact, a lot of laws about that require them to only pass rules that are not burdensome or more burdensome than necessary. So any type of input about what the cost of a regulation will be is going to be incredibly valuable to the agency. And the final kind of category of common analysis that you'll see is unintended consequences. Again, the people working in agencies typically are subject matter experts. They may have lived experiences themselves around these issues, but no one can see every angle, right, without help. And so it's entirely possible that they'll pass what they believe is or propose what they believe is a good rule, and then have someone come in and very validly tell them this rule is going to impact me differently than you expected. Please take that into consideration. That can be very, very powerful as well. Again, how you present what you believe about the rule is your comment, right? So these are four possibilities, but it can be everything from one of these to just an explanation of your personal circumstances and how the rule would have impacted you personally. That can also be useful for them, especially if you can make your personal experience broad enough that the agency can imagine it applying to lots of people. So here's a hypothetical example of what it might sound like in a rules workshop. So the introduction, my name is Robert Latham. I am the Associate Director of the Children and Youth Law Clinic. Our clinic represents kids and young adults in foster care. We've been doing it since 1996. It tells who I am, why I'm there. I've made up a rule, but I'd like to comment on Rule 65G, 4.0, whatever, specifically about the requirement that an application must be resubmitted in the local office if an applicant moves. This is not a real rule. Please don't run off thinking this is a rule. I made it up. It's the type of rule we deal with in foster care a lot because foster kids move around a lot. And I'm not going to read the analysis on the right. You can read it. But explaining why a rule that makes it so that a person can only apply in their local office, right, might impact foster kids differently, right? We talk about their instability, talk about how they don't have any say over where they live, all of that. That can, right, highlight a smaller subset of people that the rule might impact disproportionately, and the agency might be interested in that. They may be willing to create some alternatives for certain groups of people. So this is what a rule comment could sound like. Note how short it is, right? You should be able to do your rule comment in about 45 seconds. You should be prepared to be limited to a minute or less, and you should always offer, if needed, to follow up in writing afterwards or to speak with them outside of the workshop. Rules comments, especially the verbal ones, do not need to be long and complicated. Just get your point across and move on. So what is not helpful, again, talking to agency staff and observing rules comments workshops over the years, what is not helpful are just general statements. People who, hi, my name is Robert Latham. I support this rule. Thank you so much. It's nice, right? But it's not helpful to the staff and it takes up time. So general statements of support or opposition, not typically helpful. But if they call your name, you don't want to be rude, say you support and move on. But don't, going there just to say that sometimes is not particularly helpful. Again, as I said multiple times, always focus on the rule, complaining about the agency, coming in to tell them about problems you have about their agency in general. The staff can't do anything about that in that moment. And that, again, will lead to lots of frustration, both for you and for the staff. They probably do want to help you, right? That's just not the forum for that conversation. Litigating existing cases, as I said before, you should focus your comments on the future, on future people like you, on future families, future individuals, future businesses, organizations. Try not to talk too much about current ongoing issues. That can lead to all kinds of difficulties. And finally, and this is very hard, especially for those of us who are coming to a rule with lived experience or about a person that we care about, emotion is powerful in small doses. It is fatal in large doses for advocacy. And so we'll talk more about preparing yourself for this in a little bit, but anger, sarcasm, ridicule, personal attacks almost never work effectively in these settings. Mentioning people who have done wrong by name also has a tendency to backfire. Everyone who's ever worked with that person who liked them will suddenly side against you. Their friends will be very confused about what you're saying, and it will become a huge distraction. So if you've had a problem with a part of an agency or part of a community before, describing that in general can be really effective. Assigning a name to an individual who did it in this context can actually be very distracting and work against your cause. So these are a few of the topics, a few of the approaches that I've seen not work well, and the agency staff tell us did not work well. We can talk more about if other people have seen other things that are not good in these settings. Finally, a huge problem in rules workshops is you don't have a lot of time and you're trying to comment on behalf of, as I said before, all future people who might have this problem. And too many details in your comment can actually work against you. So I have here an overly complicated scenario of me trying to explain to the agency what happened and why they should pass a rule, right? We have a case right now where DCF applied for services, your agency lost the application, we reapplied, we received confirmation on April 3rd, 2024, May, dates, details, back and forth. All of that may be incredibly important to me, but in the context of a rules workshop, what it does is it paints the picture that my problem that I have in my comment is unique. It is something that I personally experienced, that the workshop staff could never imagine anyone else going through that, right? And so when you're shaping your comments, make them vague and general enough that, again, you're standing in for all future people. While you might have a very interesting story, right, about what happened in an individual case, it actually doesn't tend to work that well in the comment setting. There may be other ways to litigate this case that is not in a rules workshop. Okay. The final thing you want to do is make a clear recommendation. As I said, the agency staff really appreciate this. This helps them. Do you want them to adopt the rule? Do you want them to not adopt the rule? Or do you want them to change the rule in some way? And you may not be an expert on writing legislation or rules. That's okay, right? You can just say, I would like you to consider this rule, consider an exception in this rule for people like me. That could be the modification request. Or I don't think this rule should be adopted. It has a lot of problems. I'd like to work with you more about coming up with a better rule. That could be do not adopt type language. So it doesn't have to be hyper technical. You're not expected to draft a new rule, but giving them a clear understanding of what you're asking them to do can help them a lot. Okay, recommendations. Here's some examples of what it could sound like I just said. It doesn't have to be technical. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be, right? Especially if you are a lawyer or have, public policy background, or you have hired a lawyer to draft something. The agency staff absolutely appreciate that when you have alternative language to propose for them, but it's not necessary in this context. The last thing to consider here is what the agency has to do with your comments. And this is a point of frustration for a lot of people. The agency has to consider your comments, but they are not required to listen to them or abide by them in any way. They are not required to do what you asked. They are simply required to hear you out, try to understand what you're saying, and consider them. That's part one. Part two is they're required to build a record for the rule, meaning an actual written document that encompasses the history of how the rule was made. And that record then becomes part of the case later if there's ever a rule challenge. So they will have to actually list all the comments and list how they responded to the comment. Often the response is, we addressed the comment in another rule, or the statute doesn't allow us to do what the commenter asked. Usually the responses are pretty perfunctory, but they're required to do that. And if they just toss your comment in the trash and don't consider it and don't document it well, that could be a basis for a rule challenge later. The last thing I want to say about what they have to do is, agency staff are bound by law. They're hired by an agency who is headed by a secretary or a director who is appointed by a governor. The agency staff sitting in that room on the day you're in the workshop may be very, very sympathetic to your cause, but may not be able to write the rule you want. There's lots of things they can do softly to help you out in that situation, but most people are not going to lose their jobs over over a rule. So they may secretly hope that you challenge it later and win in court or in some other context, right? But just keep in mind, they may not be able to do what you're asking, even if they want to. Okay. Alan, I saw we had some questions. We're about to move into the it was you, actually. I have a question from Alan. So Alan asked me a question on the side about, and I think this is an important point, Alan, thank you. The comments you're making in this setting are public. They are public. You will be in public, you will be recorded, it will become part of the written record. If you want to see the record from the agency about how they handled your comment, you can request it. I think technically it's a public records request, but that's just, in Florida, that's just an email. You'd send an email to the person who is listed as a contact for the rule, ask them for a document showing how the comments were handled. DCF, for example, typically uses a spreadsheet. I'm not sure how APD does it. I've never asked for their comments, their comment rubric before, but every agency has their own system for that, and they will have to send it to you. It's part of the record. If they don't have such a system, then you should just make a note of that. That's a potential basis for a rule challenge later. Okay, we're gonna shift gears slightly because that's the process, right? Go into the room, tell them what you think, thank them for their time, and be done. For those of you who've done a lot of advocacy, it's not that simple. It's not emotionally that simple. It's not that simple to prepare. And so that's what we're going to move to next. Strategic sharing comes out of some work done by foster youth to help themselves, help each other prepare for legislative testimony. There's some resources at the end of this PowerPoint with links to some of these guides. It's incredibly useful, and it's so well done and simply put that I use it even for adults and for anyone else that's thinking about how to come into these spaces for the first time and do advocacy. So strategic sharing is really just planning in advance for the complications that can come from doing advocacy. And the first place we're going to start in this conversation is the risks of sharing. So for those of you who are those of you who are lay people or citizens who are coming in and doing this for the first time, or for those of you who are organizing people to share their story in one of these settings, please have conversations with them about the risks and how they manage those risks. The first risk from doing any kind of advocacy around personal stories is the risk to yourself. You go through the experience, you say things that you immediately regret, right? You feel that you've revealed too much information. You feel that you said something in public or to a powerful person, and now your safety and well-being feels jeopardized in some way. There's a lot of self-doubt, and there's a lot of second guessing that happens after these moments for people that are doing it, especially for the first time, even for those of us who have done it for years. And that's a risk, right? For some people, that's worth the risk. For some people, it's very overwhelming, and they have a hard time managing this. And so that's the first conversation you would want to have, either with yourself or with the other people you're working with, about like, how are we going to manage our risk to ourselves? The next related topic is the risk to others in our lives. You may inadvertently disclose information that can affect people you love and care about. And this happens so often, especially when people start answering questions about their story. They say something in this context that they didn't intend to, and then suddenly they regret it, right? And so again, we'll talk about the planning in a second, but the planning you do for that is going to be very important. The next is risk to your case. Again, I've warned us multiple times, don't bring up active cases. There's lots of reasons not to do it, but one reason is it can lead to retaliation, especially in an agency setting. Speaking out against an agency and bringing problems to their doorstep might be an effective strategy in some limited circumstances, but often just makes the staff a little more recalcitrant than they were, or a little more cautious than they were before with you, and it can actually backfire significantly. So keep that in mind. You would only want to talk about an individual case with a great deal of intentionality, and I don't recommend you do it almost ever. And then the last risk is just the risk to your cause. You may not get the response you wanted. The agency may hear you out and may tell you that that's not their concern and they may move on. You may not get the emotional feedback from the people in the room that you thought you were going to get. All of this can be incredibly discouraging. And so that's something you would want to talk with people about before you invite them to do this, that that advocacy, as we're going to say, is an ongoing event. It is not a one point in time thing you do once and win, right? It is a struggle. So when we're planning for these things, what you would hopefully do is start by talking with people about how they tell their story in different contexts, right? And the sharing circle is one way of thinking about this. The story you tell is to yourself, right, is not the same story you tell to close friends and family who are there to support and trust you, or trust and support you, right? It's the same story you tell for people with similar experiences to you, people, that will understand what you're going through and be empathetic to you. It's certainly not the same story you tell with acquaintances, right? These people that you kind of know in your life, right? They're less familiar to you, right? You start talking about the more difficult parts of your story, right? And they become overwhelmed and they start pulling away. And certainly, right, we want to be careful about the version of the story we tell in public, right? The recorded version, especially if it's going to be on the internet. That version of your story, right, can take on a life of its own sometimes, can be edited, can be taken out of context, and it can be very difficult to control, your story when it's told in public in that way. And so we have to be aware, right? And this is very difficult, especially for people that aren't used to advocacy, right? You have to be aware that your story does have to shift. It has to have different levels of detail depending on who you're speaking with. And so one way to think about that is in advance in your planning, right? Before you go in there, make a list for yourself of what is green light, yellow light, and red light information for you. Right? What is green light information, right? Information you would tell a person at the grocery store if they ask you, right? Like, I'll give you an example there. I have a son. I have a son, right? It is a thing you would say to someone and probably have no second thoughts about it, right? Yellow light information is information that you might tell somebody, but it could lead to questions, right? I have a son who was diagnosed with autism. That person may very well start asking you questions about the diagnosis and when it happened and the details of it and what it looks like, right? So yellow light information are, things you're willing to share, but maybe with some limits. Red light information is sensitive. It is things that could harm or embarrass you or other people that you care about. I give here an example. My son is 15, goes to a specific high school and experiences encapresis. I would never say these words on the internet, right? People will immediately pick out who I am, who my son is, what school he goes to, and this really, really sensitive fact about his life. And yet in rules workshops, I hear people do this all the time, and I worry about them when they do it, right? And so the balance is figure out what these pieces of information are for you personally in advance, right? Write them down, have them off to the side. And remember, you can always yield. You can always decline to answer a question. You can always say, not right now, maybe later. And that's the next slide. You need to prepare people to have emergency exits if their testimony or their statements or their comments start going, way into the red category. So there's two common strategies for this. The first is if you get a red light question, give a yellow light answer, right? If they ask you details about your son, say, well, he was diagnosed with autism, and then kind of go back to the yellow light answer. Second part of that strategy is simply explain why it's a difficult thing to talk about. The details are difficult. I'm not comfortable talking about them in public, but I would like to continue this conversation with you privately. That's a really powerful thing to say, right? It keeps the conversation going, but doesn't expose you and your family to a lot of the feedback. Oh no, I've got somebody writing on my board. I don't know how that happened, Alan. So we'll figure that out. We'll figure out how to erase that. The second strategy is just, and this is more of an advanced strategy. Politicians do this. reframe the question. They ask you about you, make it bigger, right? So many families experience the problems we're going through, or many families experience similar problems, right? Just kind of bring it back to everyone that you're there to advocate on behalf of, as opposed to the experience, the questions about your particular family or your particular experiences. Keep the themes general. If you are working with people who are operating in good faith, they'll respect these boundaries. If they're not operating in good faith, you will know very, very quickly, right? Because they'll still push you in public, even though you've asked them not to. And you probably should just exit at that point. Thank them for their time and try to communicate with them in some other way. I have seen both, especially in the legislative setting. There are people operating in good faith and sometimes not. And it can be very difficult and it can feel rude. But if somebody crosses these boundaries with you, you probably at that point should thank them for their time and move on. We're almost done, and then we'll get questions. I cannot stress enough how important this is for the individuals, families that are watching this, but also for the organizations that are trying to help mobilize families to speak out about issues they're seeing. A support group is incredibly important. And that means just set up a Zoom, let them come together, let people talk, have people share their stories together, listen to the different stories, listen to the different comments, strategize so that people aren't saying the same thing over and over again, figure out who the best messenger is for different parts of the story. Just setting aside an hour before a rules workshop just to get as many people together as possible and go through it can be more effective, it can be more efficient, but it can be really empowering for everybody involved. On the backside of the rules workshop, set up a time in advance to debrief, right? I would do it immediately after the workshop so that people can come together so that they can share their experiences and what they thought about the workshop. This is incredibly important. Don't just let people wander off back into their lives, because it can be, again, it can be very rattling to do one of these and especially not get the answer or the responses you expected. I encourage people in their debriefs to always have everyone identify one thing they want to do differently next time, right? One thing they wish they would have said differently, one thing a question they wish they would have answered differently. Have everyone identify that, because everyone's going to have those doubts after these experiences. And then also in your debrief, or also in your group work, always identify your next chance for advocacy, right? It is never over. The fight is never over. Even if you win a rule or you get a rule you wanted, the next administration can change it. You have to defend it. The fight goes on. So it can be very grounding. It can be very helpful, especially if you're feeling a little deflated, to identify what's the next fight and shift your energy over to that. I cannot stress enough how important it is to have community when you're doing this work, and this is a very simple way to do it, and I recommend that. Yeah, like I just said, the fight is never over, even if you win. Advocacy work's a marathon, not a sprint. People that do this professionally spend their whole careers doing it. For those of us who have lived experience on some of these issues, we spend our lives fighting these battles, both big and small, and just acknowledging that and holding each other up and supporting each other through that is going to be very, very important. Alan, this is my last slide, I believe. So here are some of the resources I referenced and used over the course of this presentation. Whitehouse.gov had a really nice how to effectively participate in the regulatory process. I don't actually know which White House, politics matter to you, which White House wrote it, but it's really nice. So I recommend taking a look at that. The strategic sharing toolkit, there's several versions of it, but there's a link in the PowerPoint to one of them. It's by the National Resource Center for Youth Development. Brookings and regulations.gov both have tips for comment writing that are a little more technical, but are really, really useful. And for any of you who want to talk about specific advocacy that you're working on, or just want to talk to somebody about a comment you want to give, I'm here, right? Call me, email me. I'm happy to talk as long as I can, right? If our clinic is not involved in the issue in any way. As long as I can talk to you, I'd be happy to do it and hear you out and hear what you're working on. Alan, that's it. Thank you so much for having me. And I guess
Before,
we'll open it
before
up to
we open it,
questions.
yeah, you got questions already in the thing, in the chat?
I'm not sure.
Uh, Before we open up to questions, I want to thank you for doing this. You met all expectations. I would say you exceeded expectations, but I expect the best from you because I've known you for so long and how professional you are in getting your message across. Um, I know the questions I have are probably more detailed in the weeds on different stuff that I deal with. But one question I had just to bring up is I noticed Lexis and Westlaw and all these people now have rulemaking and AI stuff to compare rules versus statute. Have you utilized that? And is that something that you think agencies will start utilizing? Because I've noticed when they've done rulemaking, they've put stuff in there that has nothing to do with the statute sometimes.
Right. Yeah, I think we have to be very careful with the current state of AI. So I'm at a university. We are discussing this constantly. And we're using the tools, right? I'm actively using these tools to try to understand them better. Um, they're helpful, they're good for drafting, but you should not trust them. I've definitely seen results from the major AI, legal AI companies that are questionable and they require a great deal of expertise to spot the problems. So I think it's just like any other expert tool. You want to be an expert before you try to use them because you have to be able to spot what's wrong. And that can be very hard in the legal context. I hope agencies will use them for drafts, but not necessarily for content, right? Like they're great at editing, but they're really bad at writing. So that's about all I can say, other than I hope everybody's very cautious with that.
Another question I have, and I'm not sure if you know it, but I've gone to them a few times when I think things were over the line. The JAPSI, Joint Administrative Procedures Committee, which is a joint committee of legislators that from the House and Senate. What's their role, and is that a forum to go to? Because I've been going to them because I feel like sometimes I'm not listened to.
Yeah, that's an incredibly powerful place to go that not very many people know about. So the legislature passed the statutes and told the executive branches, hey, write rules. And as part of the rulemaking process, those executive branch agencies have to send a nearly final draft of the rule over back to the legislature just to let the legislature look it over one last time. And the group that does that is called JAPC, JAPC, the Joint Administrative. Sorry, you said it. I apologize. I just call it the JAPC. And so JAPSI looks them over. They typically don't get too involved in the substance, right? Like I use the citrus example, right? Like whether or not an orange is ripe or not, they're probably not going to have much comment on because that's why they sent it to the Department of Citrus. But they have a lot to say about process. And if something clearly violates a statute, especially, they can send it back. They can issue comments and questions back to the executive branch, and they can do a lot to interfere, or I should say interfere, to help your advocacy, especially if you're trying to slow a rule down. JAPSI advocacy is a little advanced, but especially for the organizations that do this a lot, I recommend you have a contact over there, reach out to them, especially if you have questions about whether the rule is legal or not. Not just a good idea or a bad idea, but actually a rule that's invalid or illegal, JAPSI will be very interested in.
Are there any other questions, or do I get to keep asking mine?
No, I would just want to make a comment. One, it was very well presented, very digestible. So thank you for your preparation and presenting it. And I just wanted to ask your opinion about, it seems to me the culture around rule development has changed a lot with the advent of Zoom. I mean, I remember, decades ago, rule development felt more like a community workshop. There was more kind of give and take and interaction, personal interaction, maybe a little more passionate, but and today, these call-in conference calls and Zoom meetings just seem to be pretty sterile and feels more like just a one-way process. Do you think that has the change in the culture of rule development has any real impact on the quality of regulation that's being developed, or am I just old-fashioned?
You can be old fashioned and it can affect the quality. Both can be true. So you're right. But we're seeing this in lots of contexts, right? This conversation about accessibility versus the kind of face-to-face interactions, right? We're seeing it in the court context, we're seeing it in the legislative context. And the trade-off is those rules workshops that were in person in Tallahassee were never accessible to people that didn't live up there, right? And so there were lots of people who were not in that room. And so for them, it being on Zoom is actually a significant improvement. For those of us that had the resources and the time to be present in rules workshops and could do the face-to-face advocacy that would happen in the hallways and sitting there in the chairs and counting heads about who's there and all that stuff, and packing the room, my favorite strategy, right? Get lots of people from Tallahassee to go pack the room. We lost something in that, right? And we valued. And so a lot of advocates, both again in court and in legislative and executive contexts, are trying to find ways to balance that out, right? Ways to have the more personal contact, right? And it's difficult. So you have to be more intentional about reaching out to the agency staff. You have to be more intentional about making sure that your people are prepared to be in a Zoom setting, for example. Have them on camera. You have to, if you're recruiting individuals, have them on camera. Check their backgrounds, make sure they're clean, right? Make sure they understand how it works. It does take a lot more work to get to the same level. Agencies do have another process called negotiated rulemaking that's also complicated. They can kind of designate sides on the team or to the issue, and then kind of meet with the individual sides if there are sides. That's another way to kind of create what used to happen in the room, but most agencies are not going to do that because it requires a lot of overhead. I hear you, Mark. I absolutely hear
Yeah.
you. We
Well,
just
I
have to
appreciate
be
your
more,
comments. Those are,
yeah,
good.
we
good
just have to be more
responses.
intentional. Yeah.
Yeah, the access questions is an important one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember all those years of doing it when they would do it on conference calls, right? And you sit here staring at a phone on my desk and I couldn't see who was there. I didn't know who anybody was. Zoom was an improvement over that, but not an improvement over being in the room. Agreed.
Robert, just so you know how this will help people in the future, when a rule comes out, we send it out to, providers, but also families and stuff. But we're going to include this YouTube video to it so they can not just see that there's an opportunity to comment or come to a workshop, but also an opportunity to learn about it before they do it. Quick question that I was wondering, like, let's say they just did a rule. People made comments and they changed the rule because of the comments. Do they have to start the process over because now it's a new rule?
Right. That's a great question. It comes up a lot, and it's related to the question of when is a rule final. And what you're going to see, again, I'm going to be careful not to get something recorded here that's misleading later if the rules ever change. But what you'll see in the process is the agency has a lot of discretion to determine whether a public hearing is necessary. Now they have to document why they thought it was necessary or not necessary. So even if you requested a rule workshop on a rule, they could tell you no. They could say we don't want to take public comment. They'll have to document it, and that could be grounds for a challenge later. So they typically err on the side of just having the rules workshop, letting a handful of people show up, writing down what they say, moving on. If the rule only, sorry, the new draft only made a few technical changes, they felt like they heard everything, they can't imagine anybody having any problems with that, they will sometimes do away with a second rules workshop. Again, to their peril, though, because if it really was a serious issue, a judge in the future could very well tell them that they need to go back and do it again and invalidate their rule. So it's how do I say this? This process is complicated enough. It's why people hire lobbyists, right? To navigate you through it, to figure out, all the ins and outs and the rules and really make sure that your voice is heard in it. So if you have the resources to hire a lobbyist. You know, it's a valuable resource. But, you know, again, even, you know, citizens, lay people can participate in these, right, pretty effectively. Sorry,
I got one
I
last.
didn't fully answer your question because I don't want to over answer it.
I get it. I got one last question that came up a lot recently. There was a licensing rule for adult day trainings, and they promulgated the rule just about the same time that the law was in effect. And, you know, they hadn't done public hearings and all. Is that the rule during the time that they start licensing? Because they haven't finalized the rule. And we got a lot of questions about that because, you know, there was some stuff that clearly shouldn't have been in there. What happens when a rule hasn't been finalized yet they've implemented it?
Right. So there are a couple of answers to that. Again, it's hard to answer because there is an emergency rulemaking process that a agency can go through that will put rules into place pending the finalization of a final rule. But that's a clear process. They publish those, they're announced as emergency rules, everyone's clear that they're temporary. If it's just proposed rules, then the statute is what governs in the meantime for the most part.
Okay, that's good. That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah, the statute governs in the meantime. That's what courts are going to look at in the meantime. You know, we could have a more detailed conversation somewhere in a different setting about the difference between rules and agency practice, right? So, I mean, they're going to do what they were going to do. The question is, will a court recognize it as legal later? And again, they do that at their peril. And maybe that's a risk they're willing to take because they don't think you'll challenge, or they think a court will uphold what they did. But they definitely do that at their peril. Alan, I got a question in the chat separately to me that was important. And the gist of it is, it seems like agencies don't even know their own rules when they're trying to pass, you know, to write these rules. And I want to say a couple of things about that. So the first is that different administrations have different views on governance in general and how rules should function. Some administrations, I guess, value, right, executive expertise more and will keep people around from one administration to the other, even if they're not their people, right? Because the expertise that those folks bring from the prior administrations is very important. Some administrations want their own people in there and they bring in new people. Of course, there's always turnover as well. So there's a lot of things that can affect like institutional expertise at an agency. Some of it's intentional, some of it's not. The other thing I want to point out about that comment is, or that question is, that our job is to point out to them through the public comment process things they are missing, right? And so you know, if they're not catching it, right, I want them to be perfect. I want them to not need me. That's fine. But it's our job to actively make sure they're educated about their own rules. And that can seem counterintuitive, right? But it's incredibly important because the truth is rules are complicated and statutes are complicated, and there's federal requirements and state and case law and all of that, and people miss things. So I'm going to give them the benefit of a doubt. You know, the first couple of times they mess something up, I'll give them that, and try to help them as much as I can. If they still won't listen, then again, that would be grounds for a rule challenge later, and they choose to ignore, you know, conflicts in the rules and the regulations at their peril.
Well, thank you. I think that was all the questions. We appreciate it. This is going to make a difference in the ARC of Florida and our partners in doing a better job when rulemaking is going on so we can impact rules in a positive way. So, Robert, we appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.